The year is 1977, and you are George Lucas. Your film Star Wars has just gone into cinema, and it's flopped. But you already have a plan, because you actually already have a sequel written. It's called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and it's very strange to read in the context of modern Star Wars canon. Welcome to No Earth for November, episode S, I guess. So I read this book because I randomly found out about it, and as someone that grew up reading the Thrawn trilogy, the X-Wing book series, that kind of stuff, it was very, very strange to read because Splinter of the Mind's Eye is not written with the sort of foundation of modern Star Wars sort of canon. Even the very basic stuff is very different. So when I read it, I made a list of things that I noticed, and I actually posted them on Reddit, which I will link, but I will read my list that I put down and just talk about the things, really. So the first thing that really jumped out to me, and it's kind of weird, but like I said, X-Wing series. Within the first page, essentially Luke and Leia are going on a diplomatic mission together. He is sort of her bodyguard, sort of her love interest. That's a whole different thing. Luke is in his X-Wing, but Leia is flying a Y-Wing. And some people pointed out that, well, of course she's in a Y-Wing. It has two seats, but she's not a guest pilot. She is the pilot. She's flying it, which is odd because in modern canon, Y-Wings are very slow. You probably wouldn't want to put your dignitary on the slowest ship that you have. Literally any of the other, A-Wings are faster, B-Wings are more defense, X-Wings are a bit of both. There's just it's a bomber. It's not really what it's designed for. But clearly these things hadn't been thought of at the time. If you actually look at the original trench run sequence, there's not an appreciable mention of differences in terms of speed for the X-Wings and Y-Wings. Only that the Y-Wings are bombers, and that's why they go first. But they're not even needed because then obviously Luke's X-Wing has one. So the second point was that Darth Vader is explicitly referred to as being subordinate to Grand Moff Tarkin. Now, he's kind of subordinate. Tarkin's sort of in charge of the Death Star, but it's sort of implied, and obviously in later movies we see that actually Darth Vader is second only to the Emperor. But it just seems to be an interesting, we'll see with some later points that Darth Vader and who he was hadn't been decided yet. So the third one, lightsabers can have their blades shortened. So this is actually something that does exist in canon. I forget which one I read it in, but one of the characters can extend the length of his blade out to twice. It's almost a useless ability, actually, in that story anyway. And I'm not so much aware of the wider canon, but this appears to be something that is just typical for them. So he shortens it down to about 2 inches so he can cut his way through a door without massive unwieldy blade, which kind of makes sense, really. And on the back of that, he has to charge the lightsaber. So he nicks some blasters off some stormtroopers or guards or whatever, and while they're while they're waiting, he pulls a cable out of the bottom and plugs it into the power cell of the blaster, which is interesting because there seems to be a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Waffle around trying to get around the fact that lightsabers should use power, but they don't. Evidently, they give off light, therefore that energy has to come from somewhere, and really it should be charged. It makes sense. So the fifth point is interesting because the Imperials are explicitly racist. Now, obviously, the Empire is a metaphor for imperialism. If you didn't know that, I'm sorry, that's true. but they're very explicit about it. As in, there's an instant where they're in a bar and one of the natives is begging for drink, booze, and the Imperial officer pours it on the floor, and as the alien frog guy is licking it off the floor, they're sort of making fun of him and calling him names that would probably just be slurs, but you know. And in the same scene, it's really interesting because so Luke and Leia go undercover as workers, but the problem is all the workers are male. So they come up with this great idea that Leia is his sex slave, basically. And it's interesting because they're in a bar. It's both of them. And so no one really... People are just kind of like, well, that's a bit odd, but yeah, whatever. It seems a bit strange, like they're okay with that being done in public, which is, you know, Star Wars is very PG. This is not, as we'll get to later. So, force as a word is used slightly differently. So, someone says, force help us at some point, and it almost reminds me of Frack from Battlestar Galactica or Goram from Firefly. It's like a expletive stand-in, which is fairly standard for most sci-fi. Most of them do it. But it's interesting that this one never... Star Wars doesn't really have one. But we do have one here. And so a really interesting subtle difference is that R2-D2 is present in the story. But Luke refers to him as a D2 unit rather than R2 as a shorthand, which we get in the modern canon. Just an interesting... That was how the choice went. There are 2 occasions where a language barrier exists, and 3PO does not get involved. He's present, but he doesn't act as a translator. It doesn't come up at all. I find this really bizarre, because 3PO's line, fluent in 6 million forms of communication, is part of the reason he gets bought by Owen Lars in the first film anyway. So unless that part was added very late in the filming, after this book had already been completed, I don't know. It's just a very fascinating... Like, you guys should... Logically, this should be the solution to this problem, but that's not what happens. So the Empire is implied to be thousands of years old. It's not... There's no actual number, but Luke is thinking about sort of the degradation of society, and he's doing this in the context of the Empire's behaviour towards the natives and to others. And he's sort of like he's thinking about the slow degradation of empathy over millennia is sort of the phrasing he uses. And obviously the Empire in canon is only 25 years old. Really a blip on the history of the Star Wars canon if you think about it for too much. But it's just like it's a very subtle difference. Like, this is how it's always been. This has been the trajectory over long history, rather than specific acts of Palpatine. So the Force acts a little bit differently. It doesn't really have the living force generated by living things that we get. Of course, this is explicitly stated in Empire Strikes Back, which obviously this predates that film because this was going to be the sequel. And I think it feels a little bit more like crystal mysticism. As an example, there's a Kyber crystal is the MacGuffin of the book. That's what they're trying to get a hold of. And Luke gets a really small shard of Kyber crystal. And I think the only way I could describe this would be like the spice melange. As in, it expands his perception and his sort of understanding, and his sort of... The Force flows quicker through him. sort of channels it through more efficiently. And obviously this is exacerbated when they get to the big crystal at the end of the book. But it's just like an interesting... Obviously the Force was really not a major plot point in... as in specific to the Force, doesn't come up in the first film, and which is sort of not really getting to the point. Is sort of how a lot of Star Wars lore works. It implies things rather than explicitly states them. I think like Obi-Wan's reference to the Clone Wars in that scene, just a throwaway line, doesn't mean anything until you expand on it later with the animated series. So one of my favourite parts is they didn't quite have the idea for strong in the Force as like a phrase for meaning, sort of competency. And there's this delightful clunky phrase: "You have the Force about you." It's just fantastic, right? There's nothing. I have no words to say. It's just great. I understand why it isn't carried through, but it really should be, because I just love that phrase. So much like we have in Return of the Jedi, when the group get abducted by the Ewoks, they sort of get abducted by some natives on this planet as well, and Luke uses the Force to, get them to work with them, but he doesn't do it by causing, obviously in Return of the Jedi, 3PO lifts up and spins around, all that kind of stuff. No, he hits a native in the head with a rock, using the Force to dodge it quickly. It's like I say, it's a little bit more violent, this one. Yes, specifically with the next point is the blood and the gore. They have, I can't remember what they're called. I should have looked this up before. But there are these big alien creatures that are very strong, and at one point they go into a van or vehicle with troops in to kill them all. And there's a reference to like blood dripping off the ceiling. Obviously these guys have bashed them all to a pulp, because in canon you have the Wookiees talk about like pulling arms off and stuff, but because of the PG nature of Star Wars, you don't get that happening, not in the gruesome way it really should. Obviously this was not decided yet. So there's a little subtle mention here that Leia is having PTSD from being tortured on the Death Star, and obviously most people wouldn't even consider this as being it kind of gets brushed over a lot, the torture scene on the Death Star, but this is a much more interesting, much more realistic character progression from that point of Darth Vader turns up and she starts to freak out because duh. In another subtle detail, there's no Bacta, so you might not be familiar with it, but Bacta is in Empire Strikes Back when Luke gets rescued. He's in that tank, and that's a Bacta tank, and that's sort of a magic healing liquid, basically. But there isn't that in modern canon. If you were wounded, so one of the Imperials gets caught in a grenade blast and has cuts and shrapnel damage all over him. What you'd do is you'd have a few hours in a Bacta tank and then you'd be fine in canon. But here he sort of gets patched up with not like current, like real world level technology, obviously like an extrapolation of that. But he's covered in bandages and stuff, and it feels a bit more grounded as to the kind of medical technology they have. It's just an interesting difference. As I was mentioning earlier, the characterization of Vader is not really settled. Actually, no, you do see it in the original. Hang on, I'm talking out of no, obviously Obi-Wan. That's interesting. And this must have been finalised before all the film was done. That's interesting. Anyway, Yeah, sort of there's two more points. So the last one is that in that final altercation, Luke and Vader are standing across from each other, and Vader verbally says that Luke was the one that shot him out of the trench on the Death Star. Now, at this point, you're in the point of view of Luke, and Luke doesn't, in his mind, disagree with that. So what I'm saying is, Luke shoots Vader out the trench, and that's what happened. But obviously, in the film, Han Solo is the one that knocks him out of the trench. So it's something that hadn't been locked down just yet. And so the last one is there is a continuing relationship between Luke and Leia. That's the trajectory of those two characters. And obviously, it's sort of well accepted at this point that the relationship there hadn't been decided on. So when they get announced as being twins in Empire Strikes Back, a lot of people have noticed that's a bit of a strange choice, and clearly this is something that wasn't the original plan anyway. Which sort of makes sense if you know the kind of media that was around. So the Star Wars was written and filmed in the mid to late 70s, and the books that George Lucas was reading growing up, the 50s, 60s, was sort of on the tail end of the swords and sort of like the Barsoom books, and still using swords and stuff but on different planets and that kind of stuff. And these books, Plan 2 Romance is the genre type. And there's very clearly that comes from that, but then he decides to do his own thing later on, which is a good thing to do. So the last sort of point is the author here. So this was written by a guy called Alan Dean Foster, and it's sort of an interesting case because Alan Dean Foster sort of wrote Star Wars, but due to the contract he had with George Lucas, and I should bear in mind this is sort of rumour, fairly well established rumour, but Alan Dean Foster wrote Star Wars, but under contract with George Lucas, so that George Lucas got the credit for the writing. Obviously, Alan Dean Foster wasn't particularly fond of this deal, so he got the sequel and any other sequel possibilities, I think. He got the credit for that, which is why this book is credited to him. But then obviously, like I said at the beginning, if Star Wars had flopped, then they would have gone with this film because it's much simpler. There's only really one scene in the beginning when they approach the planet and then they crash, and the rest of it is, you could just film in a forest somewhere. A lovely low budget sequel film. But obviously Star Wars took off, and he went with a much more expensive sequel, which is Empire Strikes Back. And that sort of is where that went. And yes, I really enjoyed this book. It was kind of hard to contemplate the specific wider lore of what this book is talking about, because it feels very different. The dynamics are very different between the major and the minor parties. Pretty much everything is different. It's weird. It feels like a bad fanfic, basically. Everything's wrong. But I thought it was actually quite an interesting book, and I think you should read it.